I want you to try something for me. Picture the last time you looked at a map. Maybe it was like a big pull-down map in a classroom or...
Or maybe you were just doom scrolling
Right.
through a news app.
Yeah, exactly. Doom scrolling, and you see a graphic of a conflict somewhere. You see the continents, the blue oceans, and then you see the lines.
The grid.
Right, the grid. Those black lines zigzagging across the land,
Ah.
carving the world into pink countries and green countries and yellow countries. And we just accept them as absolute reality, right? Like, France ends here, Germany begins there. It feels permanent.
Oh, totally. It feels like a physical law, like gravity or something.
But if you actually go to that spot on the ground, if you stand with one foot in France and one in Germany, usually,
Yeah.
there is nothing there. There's no black line, no change in the color of the grass.
The birds fly back and forth without showing a passport.
Thanks.
And that's really the paradox of political geography. The map implies this neat, orderly puzzle where every piece fits perfectly. But the reality on the ground is messy, it's fluid, and often completely indifferent to the ink on the paper.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. We rarely stop to ask, who held the pen? Why does that border jog to the left for 10 miles instead of just going straight?
Or why, in some parts of the world, like the American West, the lines are perfectly straight, while in Europe or Asia, they look like a plate of spaghetti.
Right. It's so true. It is probably the single most important question you can ask if you want to understand history and, frankly, modern news. Those lines aren't just geography.
No, they are the frozen history of power, war, compromise, and sometimes just pure accident.
So today we're doing a deep dive into what the sources call the cartography of sovereignty. We've got a massive stack of research here on the 6 specific types of political boundaries.
And I have to say, reading through this material,
It's like learning the source code of the Matrix, isn't it?
it really is. Suddenly you look at a globe and you don't just see countries, you see the glitches. You understand why certain conflicts are happening right now.
It changes everything.
Yeah.
But before we get to the 6 types, we really have to define the engine that drives all of this. The sources keep coming back to a concept called territoriality.
Which I know sounds a bit like something a wolf does in the woods.
Yeah, exactly. Marking territory.
But honestly, on a primal level, it isn't far off. In political geography, territoriality isn't just about owning a piece of land. It's the act of communicating ownership.
Communicating ownership.
Right. It is a state standing up and saying, this is our box. Inside this box, our laws apply, our currency works, our police have authority, and our culture is dominant.
So it's really the organization of human space.
Exactly. And as we are about to see, humans have tried to organize space in very different ways, depending on where and when they were holding the pen.
Let's get into it then. The research categorizes these boundaries largely by when they were drawn relative to the people actually living there. It's a timeline thing. We have the before lines and the after lines.
Or, in the technical terms from the research, antecedent and subsequent boundaries.
Okay, let's start with the antecedent, the before line. The definition here seems pretty idyllic on the surface. It's a boundary established before a territory is significantly populated.
Significantly populated by the people drawing the map, at least. That's a crucial distinction we need to make.
Right.
The logic here is that if you draw the border before the masses arrive, you avoid the friction. You don't have to tell someone their house is now in a foreign country.
Because the house hasn't even been built yet.
Exactly.
The classic example the research points to for this is the 49th parallel. That incredibly long, straight border separating the western United States from Canada.
It is the perfect example of this specific mindset. This was established by a treaty in 1846. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a diplomat in London or Washington at that time. You look at a map of the American West. To you, it's just territory. It's abstract space. There were very few European settlers, Americans or Canadians, living out there yet.
So because there were no towns or factories to argue over, they could literally just grab a ruler.
Literally just grab a ruler. They could say, all right, 49 degrees north latitude, we'll just draw a straight line all the way to the ocean. Everything above is British. Everything below is American.
It sounds so clean, so efficient. No messy wars over which side of the river belongs to whom.
Well, it is efficient for the bureaucracy. It absolutely prevented future wars between the U.S. and Britain. But we have to be really clear about that phrase we used earlier, significantly populated.
Because that land was definitely not empty.
Not even close. It was full of indigenous nations. The Blackfoot, the Salish, and many other groups had lived there for millennia.
So to them, the 49th parallel wasn't an antecedent boundary at all. It was this arbitrary slash right through their ancestral hunting grounds, their trade routes, their families.
Precisely. It only describes the boundary relative to the settlement of the colonizer, not the history of the land itself. That's a huge blind spot in historical mapmaking.
Yeah, that's a really important nuance. But strictly from that geopolitical sense of U.S. versus Canada, the settler populations grew up around the line. They knew where it was before they built their town.
Which creates a very specific kind of landscape today. You can drive for hours out there, and the border is just a clearing in the woods.
Right. Now contrast that with the afterline, the subsequent boundary.
This feels like the messy reality we see in most of the rest of the world. A subsequent boundary is drawn after the cultural landscape is fully established. The map is already full.
Full of people, villages, roads, languages, religions. You can't just use a ruler anymore.
No, if you try to draw a straight line, you're going to cut right through a church or a market or someone's living room.
So these boundaries have to be negotiated. They have to wiggle.
They evolve over time. If you look at the border between the eastern United States and Canada, say up in Maine or Vermont, it is nothing like the 49th parallel. It's jagged. It winds around rivers. It follows mountain ridges.
Because that border was finalized much earlier, around 1842, in areas that had been settled by Europeans for a couple hundred years by that point.
Exactly. They had to navigate the human reality on the ground. They had to say, oh, this town is British. Okay, line goes south of it. This farm is American. The line goes north.
It's a literal negotiation with the landscape and the people. The sources also point to the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland as a subsequent boundary.
Yes. It wasn't drawn on a blank canvas. It was shaped by centuries of history, settlement, and deep cultural shifts. It had to navigate a very complex, densely populated reality.
Which actually segues perfectly into our next category.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you don't just draw a line around who happens to be where. Sometimes map makers draw a line specifically to separate people.
Right. This is where we get into consequent boundaries.
I like to think of this one as designing for difference.
That's a great way to put it. If a subsequent boundary just sort of happens as cultures evolve and bump into each other, a consequent boundary is an intentional divorce settlement.
Wow, a divorce settlement.
Yeah, it is drawn with the explicit intention of accommodating or, in many cases, segregating distinct cultural, religious, or ethnic groups.
The logic basically being, these two groups clearly cannot live under one roof, so we are going to build a wall between the bedrooms.
Exactly. And the examples in the research are pretty heavy. We mentioned Ireland just now. The partition in 1920 wasn't just following a river for the sake of geography. It was a jagged line specifically trying to carve the Protestant majority in the north away from the Catholic majority in the south.
It was a line drawn to solve a cultural conflict.
Or at least attempt to solve it. But the biggest and perhaps most tragic example in the notes is the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947.
This one is massive.
It is the ultimate consequent boundary. The British are leaving. The premise is that Hindus and Muslims require separate homelands. They cannot be one nation. So a line is drawn through the province of Punjab, which was incredibly mixed, specifically to create that religious divide.
But here's the problem with consequent boundaries, right? Lines on maps are thin, but communities are thick. You can't just separate them cleanly like you're sorting laundry.
That's the tragedy of it. Consequent boundaries assume you can perfectly sanitize a region. But in reality, you had villages where Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs had lived together for centuries.
And the partition created a humanitarian catastrophe. It displaced millions of people. The consequent line meant that suddenly, overnight, you were on the wrong side of the border.
It reminds me of the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 90s, too. I remember seeing that on the news when I was younger. The maps just kept changing every week.
Yeah, the researchers call that a textbook geopolitical mess.
Yeah.
You had a country that was artificially held together. When the Soviet influence collapsed, all those distinct ethnic groups, Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, they all wanted out.
And the boundaries that were drawn then were desperate attempts to give each group their own sovereign space, to respect the different cultures by separating them.
So a consequent boundary is basically an admission that the organization of human space has failed to be inclusive.
That's spot on. It is an admission that shared sovereignty isn't working, so they resort to segregation by sovereignty.
Which brings us to the type of boundary that doesn't care about culture, doesn't care about history, and definitely doesn't care about what the locals want. The superimposed boundary.
The imperial line, or the forced line.
This is the one that makes you look at a map and just shake your head. These are boundaries drawn by outside powers who just drop a grid right over a place.
It is almost exclusively a story of colonialism. And the setting for the most significant example of this is the Berlin Conference of 1884.
The scramble for Africa.
Right. Picture the scene because it really tells you everything you need to know. You have a bunch of European men in suits. British, French, German, Portuguese. They're sitting in a conference room in Berlin. They have a massive map of Africa on the wall. And
They just start carving.
they just start carving it up.
And most of these guys have never even been to Africa, right?
Correct. They had zero knowledge of the tribal boundaries, the linguistic groups, the trade networks, or the ancient kingdoms that were already there. They were drawing lines purely to divide up resources for themselves.
It's like, I'll take the copper mines here, you can have the rubber plantations over there.
Exactly.
The source material highlights a specific case study that really brings this home, which is the Yu people.
Yes. The Yu are a distinct ethnic group with a shared language and culture in West Africa, a completely cohesive society. But during the colonial era, the British and the French drew a line right through their territory just to separate their rival colonies.
So suddenly, half the family is in the Gold Coast, which
Right.
eventually becomes Ghana, and the other half is in Togoland, which becomes Togo.
Exactly. You literally have a situation where a brother is a British subject and a sister is a French subject. They're forced to learn different European languages in school. They need a passport to cross the street to see each other.
And the craziest part is, when those colonies became independent nations decades later, the line stayed.
That's the kicker. The line stayed. You had a singular cultural unit split in half by a border they never asked for.
And the fallout from that is massive. It led to serious post-independence conflict, with Togo at one point even claiming parts of Ghana just to try and reunite the Yu people.
It creates this profound structural instability. If you group historical enemies together in one box, you get civil war. If you split cohesive families apart into two boxes, you get irredentism.
Irredentism, meaning the desire to reclaim lost land.
Right. And that is exactly why so many conflicts in Africa today seem intractable to outsiders. We look at the news and say, why are they fighting?
But when you look at the map,
When you look at the map, you realize they are fighting over lines that make absolutely no sense for the people actually living there. They are dealing with the fallout of a map drawn by a guy in Berlin 140 years ago.
wow. Speaking of lines that make no sense, we need to talk about the ones that are just completely straight. The geometric boundaries.
Math versus reality.
Defined by straight lines, usually following latitude or longitude.
Yeah.
We touched on the 49th parallel earlier, which is kind of the celebrity of this category.
But look at North Africa. Look at the border between Egypt and Libya. It is a ruler straight line cutting right through the desert.
Why do they do this? Is it just laziness?
It's a mix of ignorance and arrogance, usually.
Yeah.
If you are a colonial surveyor and you're looking at a vast desert or a dense jungle, you often don't have the detailed topographic maps to say, follow this ridge or follow this river.
Or you just don't know where the water wells are.
Right, you don't know the landscape, so you just default to the grid. You say, the border is the 25th meridian. Done. It's super easy to write into a treaty.
The source points out an interesting overlap here. Many geometric boundaries are also superimposed boundaries.
Particularly in Africa, yes. Look at the borders between Kenya and Tanzania, or Somalia and Ethiopia. Many of those are straight lines, so they're geometric, but they were drawn by colonial powers, so they're superimposed.
Double whammy.
It really is. They ignore the physical geography, the rivers, the mountains, and they completely ignore the cultural geography.
It's funny. Nature hates straight lines.
Right.
Rivers snake, mountains curve, forests grow in patches. So when you see a perfectly straight line on a political map, you know instantly that a human forced this.
It is the ultimate artificial construct. It is the imposition of abstract math onto the messy, organic reality of the world.
Okay, so we've covered lines drawn before people, lines drawn after, lines drawn as separate, lines drawn by force, and lines drawn by math. We have one category left, and honestly, this is my favorite one because it sounds so mysterious. Relic boundaries.
The ghost line.
The definition here is a border that no longer functions politically. It's not a country border anymore, but it has left such a deep scar that you can still see it in the landscape or the economy.
Even when the wall is gone, the scar remains. That's the key takeaway here.
And the ultimate example of this has to be the Berlin Wall.
Without a doubt. Think about it. For decades, you had a physical concrete barrier separating East and West Berlin. Communism on one side, capitalism on the other. Totalitarianism versus democracy. Two completely different economic systems running side by side.
Then 1989 happens. The wall comes down. Germany is reunified. Politically, the border is deleted. It's just gone.
But the source makes a really fascinating point. If you look at the data today, decades later, or even if you just look at the architecture, you can still see the lines.
Specifically the lighting, right? I love this detail from the research.
Yes, it's amazing. If you look at a satellite photo of Berlin at night, You can actually see the old border. The former West uses mercury vapor lamps that glow white. The former East uses sodium vapor lamps that glow yellow.
You can physically see the ghost of the Cold War from space just by looking at the streetlights.
It's wild. It's like the city has a memory.
And it goes way deeper than just the lights. The source specifically mentions housing. In the former West, housing tends to be described as vibrant and varied, which is a legacy of Western economic support and individual ownership.
Right, and in the former East, you still see a lot of that dull and drab Soviet-style block housing.
So even though you can drive across that line freely today without stopping, the economic imprint is still absolutely there.
It creates an economic relic boundary. You see it in voting patterns, in unemployment rates, even in infrastructure. The political line is erased, but the social and economic line is a relic that might take generations to completely fade.
Another historical example mentioned in the text is the Great Wall of China.
Right. Obviously, that doesn't mark the edge of China anymore. The modern country extends far beyond the wall. But it stands as this massive historical marker.
It tells you, at this specific moment in history, this is as far as the empire could reach.
Exactly. It's a fossil of a political reality.
It really brings us back to that idea of territoriality you started with. We are adaptable creatures. If you put a wall up for 40 years, society molds itself around that wall. You can't just knock it down and expect the mold to break instantly.
We organize our entire lives around these barriers. Where we work, who we marry, what language we speak. That inertia is incredibly powerful.
So let's bring this all together. We've decoded the map. We have antecedent, the before line, subsequent, the after line, consequent, the divorce line, superimposed, the colonial line, geometric, the math line, and relic, the ghost line.
It's quite the toolkit for understanding the world.
It really is. And I think for you listening, the relevance here is massive. The next time you scroll past a headline about a conflict, whether it's in Kashmir or the Balkans or the Horn of Africa, don't just look at the fighting, look at the line.
Ask the question, what kind of boundary is this? Was it drawn to separate people, like a consequent boundary? Or was it drawn by an empire that just didn't care, like a superimposed boundary?
Because if you understand the line, you understand the grievance. You realize that a war in 2026 might just be trying to solve a mistake made in 1884.
Or 1947. Maps aren't objective truths, they are arguments. Every border you see is just a decision made by someone with power, usually at the expense of someone without it.
That's a sobering thought. The map on the wall is just a record of who won the argument.
And who lost their land.
So here is our final thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. We've been talking about international borders, the big, thick lines on the globe. But I want you to look closer to home.
Think about your own city or town.
Exactly. Are there invisible walls right where you live? Maybe there's a train track where one side is wealthy and the other has been historically underfunded. The literal wrong side of the tracks.
Or a highway. Think about the interstate highway system in the U.S. Often, those highways were built right through specific, usually minority, neighborhoods, splitting communities entirely in half.
And those act just like relic boundaries. There's no guard tower, there's no passport control. You can drive right under the overpass.
But the economic and social divide is just as real as an international border.
The property values are different, the school districts are different, the life expectancy might even be different.
Those are lines drawn by city planners and zoning boards decades ago. They are the superimposed boundaries of our daily lives.
It turns out we are navigating these invisible geometries every single day.
Yeah.
We just need to learn how to see them.
And once you see them, you really can't unsee them. Thanks for deep diving with us into the cartography of sovereignty.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll catch you on the next one.